Wyoming Territory, August 1877. The baby's cry was too loud. Brielle Tabor pressed her hand gently over her daughter's tiny mouth, heart hammering behind her ribs as she crouched low behind the broken timber wall of the burned-out homestead. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the leftover stench of gunpowder clinging to the scorched earth. Her arms trembled as she cradled the infant tighter against her chest, praying the outlaws had not circled back. She had not slept in almost 2 days. The baby, her little girl, named Viola, was barely 3 weeks old. Her hair was soft and dark, her face delicate and perfect. Brielle had wrapped her in a threadbare wool shawl, trying to keep her warm while hiding the soft sounds she made. She was all Brielle had left in the world. They had come at dusk. The men who once rode with Viola's father, men without mercy, without cause. They had found out he was dead, and now they wanted something he promised them. Land, gold, Brielle did not know. All she knew was they had torched the cabin, ransacked the barn, and hunted her like prey. She was no one's wife. Never had been. Viola had been born under the shameful whispers of a town that barely tolerated her presence. She had buried her mother last spring alone. No one had come to help when the outlaws arrived. No one had come at all, except him. He had shown up that morning, just after sunrise, riding a tall buckskin horse with a rifle slung across his back and dust on his boots. He had a quiet, watchful way about him, like a man who had lived through too much and said too little. His coat was worn, his hat pulled low, but his voice when he spoke was steady. "Ma'am," he had said, eyes flicking to the baby in her arms, "you need to move. They will not stop until they find you." She had not asked his name then. She had not trusted him. But she had followed him, running through the hills, stumbling over rocks and brush, barefoot with Viola clutched close. He led her to this place, an old line shack, half burned in some range war long before her time. Now she crouched in the corner while he stood just beyond the doorway, rifle to his shoulder, watching the tree line. "They are not coming back tonight," he said. She looked up, startled. "How do you know?" "Because they rode east. I counted 4 of them. They are not smart enough to leave one behind. You could be wrong." "I am not," she studied him. He was tall, broad-shouldered under his coat. His jaw was rough with stubble, and his eyes were a grayish blue like a winter lake. He had a scar beneath his left cheekbone, thin and pale like a knife had once kissed him too close. "You have a name?" she asked. "Silas Ward." She clutched Viola closer. "Why are you helping me?" He shrugged one shoulder. "Because I can." "That is not a reason. It is enough for me." She wanted to press him more, but Viola stirred again, fussing softly. Silas stepped back into the shack, closing the door behind him. He moved slow, careful not to startle her. "Let me hold her," he said, voice low. Brielle hesitated, then handed Viola over with shaking hands. Silas cradled her like he had done it before, like he knew how. He rocked her gently, murmuring something under his breath. The baby quieted almost instantly. "You have children?" Brielle asked. "I had a daughter," he said quietly, "years ago." She looked away, not sure what to say to that. Silas glanced back at the door. "If they find you again, they will not leave you alive, nor the baby, I know. I can take you somewhere safe. I know a place in the Wind River Range, an old trapper's cabin, high up. It is hard to reach. They will not find you there." Brielle rubbed her temple. Her body ached from running, from fear, from carrying her child and hiding in silence. She had nothing left, no food, no home, no one. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to. I see enough." "Enough to what?" "To offer you protection." He paused. "And if it helps, my last name," she blinked. "What? If you take my name, you and the baby become mine." "A wife and child are harder to touch than a woman alone. You would be under my protection, legal and otherwise." Brielle's chest tightened. "You would marry me, if you want it. No expectations, no obligations, just safety." She stared at him. He was not handsome in the way young girls dreamed of. He was scarred, sunburnt, hard-edged, but there was something solid in him. "Honest, for how long?" she asked. "As long as you need." Viola yawned against his chest. Brielle's throat tightened. "What if I want more than safety?" Silas looked at her, expression unreadable. "Then you can have that too." She let out a sharp breath and sank to the floor, tears burning behind her eyes. She had not cried in weeks, not when the baby came, not when the house burned. Not when she buried the last of her family. But now, for the first time, she felt something shift, something like hope. "All right," she whispered. Silas nodded once, then reached into the satchel at his side and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "Jerky, dried apples, hard biscuits. Eat. We leave at first light." She took the food with shaking hands. Later, when Viola was asleep in her arms and the fire burned low, she looked across the flame at the man who had silently taken up watch again. "Silas," he turned his head toward her. "Thank you," he nodded once. "Get some sleep, Brielle." She did. For the first time in days, she slept. The trail narrowed beneath the pines, winding through a shallow creek bed where the water cut cold around their boots. Silas walked ahead, leading the buckskin by the reins, while Brielle followed close behind with Viola nestled against her chest in a sling made from an old flour sack. The child slept on, her cheek pressed to her mother's collarbone, her breath soft and steady. The sun had only just crested the ridge when they set out, and now it hovered low behind them, casting long shadows between the trees. A woodpecker knocked somewhere in the distance, and the hush of wind through pine needles filled the spaces between their footfalls. The quiet wasn't empty, it held things, carried them. Brielle felt it in her ribs. "How far is the cabin?" she asked, her voice hushed in deference to the stillness. "Another day's ride, maybe a little more," Silas said without turning. "We'll stop before nightfall. There's a dry cave up ahead with a spring nearby. I've used it before." She adjusted the sling where it cut across her shoulder. "You said you'd been up here. What brought you through this way before?" "Work. Trapping, mostly. Some guiding when I could stomach it." "You don't guide anymore." He paused long enough to glance back at her. "Folks started bringing too much with them: mirrors, china, feather beds. Started thinking the land ought to change for them, instead of the other way around." Brielle stepped over a fallen branch, careful not to jostle Viola. "That seems to be how most people think." Silas didn't answer, but there was something in the way his jaw set that told her he agreed. They climbed steadily, the trees thinning as the elevation rose. Around midday, they stopped to rest near a grove of aspens, their leaves shimmering like coined silver in the breeze. Silas watered the horse while Brielle sat on a flat rock, stretching her legs and nursing Viola beneath her shawl. "You from the territory?" she asked once the baby had drifted off again. "No," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I was born near the Arkansas River, Kansas side." "What brought you west?" He sat down on the ground beside a stump, elbows resting on his knees. "Left young. My father was a drunk. My mother died when I was 15. After that, I just kept going." Brielle studied him. He spoke plainly without bitterness. There was no performance in him, no hunger for pity, just facts laid down like fence posts. "I didn't expect you to be kind," she said. His brow lifted slightly. "Why not? Because most men who look like you aren't." Silas glanced down at the dirt between his boots. "Most folks don't see what's in front of them. They see what they're afraid of or what they want to use." She wrapped the shawl tighter around Viola and stood. "Or what they've lost." He looked up at her then, eyes steady. "You're not lost, Brielle. I feel like it. Feelings pass, some quicker than others." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. They moved on before the light shifted too low, and by the time dusk settled over the ridge, they reached a narrow path that led to a shallow overhang nestled against a granite wall. The cave was dry, as he'd said, and the spring bubbled nearby, half hidden by scrub. Brielle laid out a blanket for Viola and set about building a small fire while Silas gathered dry wood. When the flames were steady, he handed her a tin cup of boiled water steeped with wild mint. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing his as she did. "You don't ask many questions," she said after a while. "I figure people give what they want to give. You're not curious. I'm patient." She sipped the tea and watched the firelight catch in the lines of his face. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either, just worn in the way of men who have lived a long time in a short number of years. "I was 17 when I left home," she said. "My mother was already sick. I thought I could find work in Cheyenne. I ended up scrubbing floors for a boarding house that doubled as something else." Silas didn't interrupt. "By the time I realized I was carrying, I had no place to go back to. My mother passed before I could get word to her." She glanced down at Viola, whose hand had curled into a loose fist against the edge of the blanket. I stayed on a while, then I left. I thought I could disappear. You almost did, he said softly. Brielle looked up, startled by the weight of his voice. Silas leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely. You've done what most wouldn't. You kept her safe. You didn't back down. That's not nothing. A lump rose in her throat, but she forced herself to swallow it. Do you ever stop running? He met her gaze. You do when you've got something worth staying for. The fire popped. Brielle looked down at her daughter, warm and sleeping, and then back at the man across from her. What if I don't know how to stay? She asked. Silas didn't smile, he never did, but there was a quiet in his eyes that steadied her. Then I'll teach you how. Night set in full, the stars crowding the sky so thick they looked stitched into the black. Brielle lay beside Viola, listening to the wind move through the pines. Just beyond, Silas sat with his back to the stone, rifle across his lap, watching the dark. She didn't feel alone anymore. Not quite, and for now, that was enough. The morning came cold and colorless, the sky sealed in gray cloud. They broke camp without speaking much, Silas checking the trail ahead while Brielle wrapped Viola snug against her chest, the child still drowsy from sleep. The air was thinner this high, and Brielle felt it in the drag of her limbs as they climbed a quiet, persistent burn in her thighs and calves that reminded her how far they'd come. By late afternoon, the path narrowed to a shelf of rock above a steep ravine. The horses' hooves clinked against the stone, and Silas moved slow, one hand on the reins, the other steadying Brielle when the wind caught her balance. He stopped just before a bend in the trail and pointed with his chin. Cabins up behind that ridge. Quarter mile, maybe less. She didn't speak, but her breath caught in her chest, all the same something between relief and the dull ache of not knowing what came next. The cabin stood low and long, built from hand-hewn logs blackened by weather, its roof patched with moss and rusted tin. A narrow chimney leaned slightly to the left, and a wooden rain barrel sat half full beneath the eaves. The clearing around it was overgrown with fern and wild grasses, but the structure itself held firm, solid, waiting. Silas pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside first, clearing the room with practiced eyes. No tracks inside, no sign of use since I left it last spring. Brielle crossed the threshold slowly, Viola still pressed close and let her eyes adjust to the dim. The main room was one chamber, with a hearth at the far end and a rough-cut table near the shuttered window. Against the wall stood a narrow cot layered with wool blankets, and in the corner, a small iron stove with a stack of dry wood beside it. He moved to open the shutters. I'll fetch water and check the traps. There's usually snowshoe hare this time of year. She looked around the room, then back at him. You kept this place. I built it, he said simply, and stepped back outside. She stood in the stillness for a long moment, breathing in the raw scent of pine and smoke-stained timber. Then she laid Viola down on the cot and tugged the shawl free, letting the baby stretch and blink up at the rafters. There was no cradle, no soft linen, no painted walls. But there was shelter. There was warmth. By sundown, Silas had brought in water from the spring and 2 rabbits cleaned and dressed. He skinned them outside and came in to cook, his movements precise but unhurried. Brielle watched him prepare the stew, noting how he added the dry herbs from a tin without measuring, how he kept a hand near the pot even when stepping aside. She sat on the floor near the hearth, Viola in her lap, and fed the fire until it glowed steady. The baby's fingers curled around her mother's thumb, and for a while neither of them spoke. Once the stew was done, Silas handed her a bowl and sat across from her on the floor. They ate in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of spoons against tin. After a while she asked, "Why did you build this place?" He looked into his bowl for a long moment. "I needed somewhere no one else could follow. But you didn't stay." "No," she hesitated, then pressed. "What drove you out?" He met her eyes. "A man can run from a grave, but he carries the dirt with him." Brielle didn't ask whose grave he meant. She wasn't ready to know. Not yet. Instead, she stood and began folding the blankets on the cot, adjusting them to fit both her and the baby. "There's only one bed. I'll take the floor," he said immediately. "You built the place, you should take the cot." "I've slept colder and harder." She paused, her hands stilling. "You don't have to keep proving something. I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" He looked up at her, his face unreadable in the firelight. Trying not to scare you. That struck something deep, something fragile and sore. She turned away, adjusting Viola's blanket. You haven't. I know I could, he said. That's why I'm careful. She sat down slowly, the baby already drifting toward sleep again. You don't talk like most men. I don't think like most men. She studied him, the way his eyes stayed on hers, steady and unflinching. You said you'd give me your name, but you haven't asked for mine. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She reached down and tugged the blanket higher over Viola's shoulder. It's Tabor, Brielle Tabor, he nodded once, as though the name settled into him like a fact he'd carry forward. Then if you want it, I'll be Silas Tabor. The room went quiet again. Outside, wind brushed the eaves, low and steady. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing soft gold against the walls. Brielle didn't answer right away, but she didn't need to. She laid back on the cot with Viola curled against her chest, and just before her eyes closed, she said, You can move the chair closer, if you want. He did. And neither of them said another word. The first snow came in the night. Brielle woke to the soft hush of it against the roof, the kind of quiet that settled deep, like the world was holding its breath. She drew the wool blanket higher over Viola, watching the faint white light seep through the shutter cracks. The baby's breath was warm against her collarbone, her tiny hand curled beneath her chin. Across the room, Silas stirred from the chair near the hearth. He rolled his shoulders once, then stood and poured water into the kettle. His coat still hung on a peg by the door, damp around the hem from the evening's last trip to the spring. You slept sitting up again, Brielle said. I've done worse, he answered. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Viola. There's room on the cot, I know there is, but you won't take it. I will if you ask me to as a need, not out of kindness. She met his gaze. You think I don't need you. I think you haven't decided yet. Brielle looked down at her child, who stirred and fussed softly. She ran a hand over Viola's back, then rose and moved toward the hearth while Silas poured hot water into a tin mug and handed it to her. Did you ever come here with someone? She asked. No, you built this place alone and never shared it. I didn't plan to live in it long. She drank, letting the warmth move through her chest. Then why keep it standing? He crouched beside the stove, feeding in another piece of pine. I guess I didn't want it to end the way everything else had, falling apart. Brielle leaned against the table. Have you ever been married? No. You ever come close? No, he said again, quieter this time. Not after Clara. She held still. That was your daughter's name, he nodded. What happened to her? Silas rose slowly, brushing his palms against his trousers. She died in winter. Fever came quick. She was 5. Brielle's throat tightened. Her mother didn't stay. She left before Clara could walk. She watched his face, but he wasn't hiding. He just wasn't offering anything more than he could bear to say. She respected that. She looks like her, he said suddenly, nodding toward Viola. Brielle followed his gaze. How do you mean, the way she curls her hand when she sleeps? She didn't reply. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like reaching. Later, while Viola napped in the sling against her back, Brielle followed Silas outside as he shoveled snow from the path to the woodshed. The clouds hung low, heavy with more to come, and the air bit at her cheeks. You ever think about leaving Wyoming? She asked, her breath clouding between them. I did once. Got as far as Idaho before I turned back. What stopped you? Didn't feel right. There's something about this land, it's rough, but it gives back if you listen to it. She watched him drive the shovel into a drift. I used to think leaving was the only answer, that if I could just get far enough, I'd stop being afraid. You still afraid? Not like I was. But I still look over my shoulder. He lifted another scoop. That's not fear, that's memory. Brielle knelt and began gathering kindling from beneath the eaves. What would you do if they came back? I'd make sure they didn't leave. She didn't doubt him. That evening, while Viola cooed and kicked on a folded quilt near the hearth, Brielle stitched a tear in the hem of her skirt. Silas sat at the table, whittling a length of pine into a spoon. The silence between them was comfortable, like a song without words. Do you want her to call you father? Brielle asked, her voice steady. Silas looked up, his hand stilling. Only if it's true for her, she nodded once. Then I think it will be. He set the carving down. You don't speak lightly. I can't afford to. He rose and crossed the room, crouching beside Viola. She kicked her feet and made a soft, gurgling noise as his finger brushed her belly. "I won't leave," he said. Brielle set the needle aside. "I didn't ask you to promise that. I'm not promising. I'm just telling you what's already true." She moved beside him, kneeling on the floor. Viola reached between them with tiny fingers, touching both their hands at once. "You said I hadn't decided," Brielle murmured. "But I have," he looked at her. "And I want your name, I want this place, I want what we haven't said yet." Silas didn't flinch. He only searched her face like reading a map he already knew by heart. "Then it's yours," he said. Snow thickened against the window, but inside the warmth held. Viola laughed for the first time, a clear, small sound that made both of them still. And then Brielle smiled, the kind that stayed. The marriage was quiet. No preacher, no witnesses. Just the two of them standing in the woods behind the cabin where the snow had begun to melt into the dark earth, and the silence was thick with pine and thaw. Silas said the words, low and sure. Brielle repeated them, her hand in his, her voice steady. They carved their names into a strip of birch bark and buried it beneath a flat stone by the spring, the way trappers marked their bonds. No sermon could have made it more binding. Spring came slower in the mountains. The drifts receded inch by inch, revealing sodden earth and sharp green shoots, crocus blooming in quiet defiance beneath the trees. Silas built a cradle from pine boards he planed smooth with his own hands. He shaped the rockers to curve gentle and true, sanding each joint until it fit without creak or catch. Brielle lined it with wool and stitched a coverlet from leftover cloth. Viola slept deeper there than she ever had. One afternoon, while Silas repaired the roof, Brielle dug a small bed for planting near the south wall. She knelt barefoot in the soil, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a scrap of muslin. The sun caught the curve of her neck as she worked, and when he looked down from the ladder, something in his chest went still. "Thought you weren't staying long," she said without glancing up. "I didn't know what I needed until I set it down. You planning to grow anything useful up there?" She pointed with the trowel toward the mossy roofline. He grinned without showing teeth. "Beans, maybe, or sky," she laughed, and he climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag as he crossed to her. She looked up when he stopped beside her, shielding her eyes. "You ever been kissed in dirt?" he asked, her smile softened. "I haven't been kissed in a long while." He knelt beside her, boots sinking into the fresh, turned soil. "Then I'd like to fix that." She leaned forward and met him halfway, the kiss unhurried, tasting of sun and pine and all the things they hadn't needed to say aloud. When she pulled back, her palm stayed on his cheek. "I love you," she said simply. Silas didn't blink. "I've loved you since I saw you run and didn't fall." She laughed again, quietly, and rested her forehead against his. "Then we're even." He kissed her once more, then helped her to her feet. That night, after Viola had fallen asleep in her cradle, they lay together beneath the quilt, the fire burning low. Brielle traced the scar beneath his cheekbone with her fingertip. "How'd you get that?" "Knife in Fort Fetterman. Man thought I'd cheated him at cards." "Did you?" "No. But I did take his horse when he came at me." She smiled, curling into his side. "You're not what I thought I'd end up with. And what you think? Someone with softer hands, less weather in his eyes." "You want softer hands?" "No," she said, brushing hers over his chest. "I want yours." He pulled her closer, his voice rough with sleep. "Then they're yours." Days became weeks, and weeks became a rhythm, wood chopped, snares checked, meals cooked side by side. Brielle took to humming as she worked, low and tuneless, but it filled the cabin with something warm. Silas showed her how to shoot a rifle, how to track through snowmelt, how to tell bear sign from elk. She was precise with her aim. He told her she was the only person he'd ever seen who didn't flinch. One morning, Viola took her first step bare feet on the cabin floor, arms outstretched, windmilling. Brielle gasped, crouching with open arms as the child wobbled forward. Silas watched from the doorway, one hand braced on the lintel, his smile quiet and full. "She's fast," he said. "Like her father," Brielle murmured, lifting Viola into her arms, "but steadier." The past no longer clawed at her. The men who'd hunted her had long since vanished, either into the winter or into the ground. Silas had made sure of that, one by one, before they ever reached the ridge. The cabin grew with them. Silas added a lean-to for supplies, then a second cot for when Viola would need her own bed. Brielle planted herbs beside the vegetables yarrow, lavender, boneset. She began to dry them, tie them in bundles, and hang them from the rafters. By the following spring, she was known as a healer in the lower valley. Women came with chilblains, with coughs that wouldn't lift, with swelling that frightened them. She treated them gently, never asked for more than a hen or a sack of flour in return. Silas rode down with her when the trail was clear, carrying Viola in a sling against his back. They never spoke of leaving. There was no need. That summer, Brielle found herself humming one of Clara's songs, something Silas hadn't heard in over a decade. He froze when she sang it, his mouth parting slightly. "Where'd you learn that?" Viola started humming it first. "I just followed." He crossed the room slowly, then took her hands. "That was Clara's favorite. She remembered it through you," Brielle said. He bent and kissed her palms. Years passed, but they didn't count them. They marked time by Viola's growth, by the changing scent of seasons, by the feel of each other's hands at the end of the day. They never grew tired of the quiet, never tired of the work, never tired of each other. One autumn morning, Silas came in from the woods with a red maple leaf in his hair. Brielle plucked it free, pressed it into the ledger she kept for trade, and kissed his brow. "I never thought I'd belong," she said. "You always did," he answered, and she did. In the cabin high in the Wind River Range, with a man who spoke little and meant everything, with a daughter who sang without knowing why. She belonged in the stillness, in the soil, in the steady rhythm of a life that chose her as surely as she had chosen it. They grew old together, but never apart. And when the last snows came, they sat hand in hand by the hearth, the fire low, the cradle long put away, and the silence full of everything they'd built from nothing but trust and time and love.